are smashed one after the other. Sounds like something from a horror movie, right? But in the Middle Age, picture this. You're lowered into a pot of boiling oil, or tied to a giant wheel as your bones s. This was real life. Tonight, we're going to look at punishments so cruel and so shocking that you'll wonder how anyone survived the medieval world. And stick with me because by the end, I'll reveal a punishment so terrifying it even made executioners sick to their stomachs. If you love exploring the darkest corners of history, hit subscribe because this is only the beginning. When people think of the Middle Ages, they picture castles, knights, and tournaments. But life back then wasn't all glory and fairy tales. The justice system was built on fear. Punishment wasn't about fairness, it was about sending a message: step out of line and you'll pay in pain. Tonight, we're going to uncover punishments most people have never heard of. Some were designed to humiliate, others were made to kill slowly. All of them show just how brutal the medieval world really was. One of the worst punishments was the breaking wheel. Imagine standing in the town square, the cold wind biting your face. The crowd gathers, whispering nervously, waiting for the punishment to begin. At the center stands a giant wooden wheel, taller than a man. It looks like something from a cart, but it is not meant for travel. It is meant for breaking. The condemned is dragged forward, their hands and feet tied tightly with ropes. They are laid across the spokes of the wheel, arms and legs stretched wide, unable to move. Then the executioner steps forward holding a heavy iron bar. He does not strike the head or chest, not yet. He starts with the arms, smashing them one at a time. The sound of bone cracking echoes across the square. The victim screams, but the blows keep coming, moving down to the legs, breaking them like twigs. Sometimes, if the crowd begged for mercy, the executioner delivered a final blow to the heart or had a quick death called the coup de grace, the mercy stroke, but mercy was not always given. Often, the broken body was left tied to the wheel, raised high on a post so everyone could see. Birds circled above. Crows picked at the wounds while dogs snapped at the feet. Death came slowly, sometimes over days. The breaking wheel wasn't just a punishment, it was a public warning. In Germany, France, and across Europe, it was used to show that no one, no matter how strong or defiant, could escape the power of the law. People remembered the screams long after the wheel was taken down. And as terrible as this was, the Middle Ages had punishments that didn't just break bones, they invited creatures of the night into the horror. If the breaking wheel was about breaking bones, the next punishment was about breaking the mind. The rat torture: picture yourself in a dungeon. The air is damp, the smell of rot heavy. Chains clink as you're strapped to a wooden table. You hear scratching inside a small cage. Then you see them rats, wild and hungry. The cage is tied to your stomach. At first, the rats scurry around, scratching at the bars. You think maybe this is just intimidation, but then the guard brings a hot iron and places it against the cage. The rats panic. They need to escape, but the only way out is through you. They claw. They bite. Slowly at first, then more frantically. Imagine the sensation of tiny claws digging into your flesh, teeth tearing into your body as the heat drives them deeper. You can't move. You can't fight back. You can only scream and pray for it to end. This wasn't just about physical pain, it was psychological terror. Even hearing the squeaks and feeling the scratching could drive a prisoner into madness before the first bite ever landed. In medieval Europe, it was used in dungeons to extract confessions, to punish traitors, or simply to terrify others into obedience. And while rats brought fear in the shadows, not all punishments relied on animals. Some were designed to silence people forever, not through death, but through humiliation so cruel it destroyed lives. Words were dangerous in the Middle Ages. A careless insult, a rumor, or even a strong opinion could put you in serious trouble. And for women, the punishment could be the scold's bridle. This was a device made of iron, shaped like a cage, fitted over the head. At first glance, it looked like a helmet, but inside, it was pure torment. A flat piece of metal, sometimes with spikes, pressed down on the tongue. If the woman tried to speak, it cut into her flesh. Talking became impossible. The victim was forced into silence, but that wasn't all. Women wearing the bridle were often paraded through the town. Imagine the humiliation walking the streets while neighbors laughed, pointed, and shouted insults. For many, this was worse than physical pain. It destroyed dignity, silenced voices, and branded women as troublemakers. The scold's bridle was used in England and Scotland, often on women accused of gossiping, lying, or witchcraft. It wasn't designed to kill, but the damage it did was lasting, and it reminds us that punishment in the Middle Ages wasn't always about crime, it was about control. Control of the body, control of the mind, and, in this case, control of women. And if silence was cruel, some punishments went even further. They didn't just silence you, they cooked you alive. In 1531, King Henry VIII of England made boiling alive the official punishment for poisoners. Yes, boiling. Imagine standing before a giant cauldron filled with water, oil, or tar. The fire underneath crackles, the liquid bubbles and steams. The condemned is tied up, struggling, begging for mercy, but there is none. Sometimes the victim was dropped in all at once. The crowd would hear the immediate screams, see the violent thrashing as flesh burned and blistered. Other times, the punishment was made slower. The person was lowered inch by inch, screaming louder with every part of their body that touched the boiling liquid. Witnesses wrote about the smell of burning flesh, the horror on the faces of those forced to watch. For Henry, it wasn't about justice. It was about making an example. Poison was considered cowardly and dangerous, and he wanted everyone to know the price. It was rare, but when it happened, people never forgot. Because unlike a sword or a rope, boiling was drawn out, public, and unforgettable. But as horrific as this was, there were punishments that made even boiling look quick, punishments that cut the body apart piece by piece. One of the most chilling medieval punishments was the saw execution. The victim was hung upside down by their ankles. At first, this position didn't seem deadly, until you realized its purpose. Hanging upside down kept the victim conscious longer as blood rushed to the head, and then the sawing began. The executioners would place a large saw between the victim's legs and begin cutting. Downward, slowly, carefully, the crowd watched as the saw moved through flesh, bone, and organs. Because of the upside-down position, the victim didn't bleed out quickly. Many stayed alive until the saw reached the chest. This was not only punishment, it was performance. A gruesome show meant to terrify anyone who thought of breaking the law. Accounts place this method in Spain, parts of Eastern Europe, and even the Middle East. Imagine standing in the crowd, knowing that one wrong choice could put you on that beam. That was the true power of punishments like this. They scared people into obedience. But while being cut apart was horrific, the Middle Ages also had punishments that peeled a person alive, turning skin itself into a message. To be flayed alive was one of the most feared punishments in history. The executioner would take a sharp knife and begin at the arms or face, slicing the skin away from the body slowly, carefully. The victim screamed, but the process went on. Piece by piece, the skin was removed. Some victims stayed alive through much of it, feeling every cut. Flaying wasn't used for petty crimes, it was saved for traitors. People who betrayed their king or lord, their skin was sometimes displayed on city walls or nailed to gates as a warning to others. Imagine walking into town and seeing human skin stretched above the entrance. You didn't need words to know the message, betray, and this will happen to you. This punishment is mentioned not just in medieval Europe, but in ancient Assyria and even beyond. It crossed cultures because it was so effective at creating fear. It wasn't just the pain. It was the horror of becoming less than human, reduced to a warning sign. And while flaying was meant to terrify, not all punishments were about death. Some were about humiliation, making a person a living joke. Not every punishment spilled blood, some were cruel because of shame. One of the strangest was the drunkard's cloak. If someone was caught drunk in public in medieval England or Germany, they could be punished with this humiliating device. A large wooden barrel, hollowed out, with holes cut for the arms and head. The drunk was shoved inside, wearing it like clothing. Then they were marched through the streets for everyone to see. The barrel was heavy and clumsy. It rubbed against the skin, slowed every step, and turned the offender into a laughingstock. Crowds shouted insults, children threw mud, sometimes even rotten food. There was no escape. The punishment turned one man's shame into entertainment for the entire town. The point was simple. Drinking too much wasn't just a private mistake. It was a crime against public order, and this punishment made sure you would never forget it, nor would your neighbors. People feared it not because it hurt, but because it destroyed dignity. In an age where reputation meant everything, being laughed at by your whole community could ruin your life. The drunkard's cloak shows us that medieval justice wasn't only about pain, it was also about fear of humiliation. But humiliation could quickly turn deadly, especially when tied to water, where the line between punishment and death was frighteningly thin. The dunking chair, also called the cucking stool, was another punishment that blended shame with danger. A wooden chair was fixed to the end of a long beam. The accused, usually a woman, was strapped into it. Then, in front of the gathered crowd, she was swung out over a river or pond and plunged into the cold water. Sometimes it was done once or twice, enough to scare and humiliate. Other times, the dunking went on until the victim choked, fainted, or even drowned. It was often used against women accused of gossip, lying, or witchcraft. In witch trials, the logic was cruel. If the woman sank and drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty and would be executed later. It was a no-win situation. For the crowd, it was theater. People laughed, cheered, or gasped as the chair splashed into the water. For the victim, it was terror. Cold water filled the lungs, straps cut into the skin. And death was always one dunk away. The dunking chair shows how easily medieval justice mixed entertainment with cruelty. Pain wasn't always the goal. Sometimes humiliation, fear, and the risk of death were punishment enough. But if water was dangerous, iron was worse. Because the next device turned a coffin into a chamber of slow, spiked death. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most infamous medieval torture device. A tall, coffin-shaped box standing upright, its inside lined with sharp iron spikes. The victim was forced inside, the doors closed. The spikes pierced the body, arms, legs, chest. They didn't kill instantly. Instead, they cut just deep enough to cause bleeding and unbearable pain. Trapped in darkness, the prisoner bled slowly, every movement driving the spikes in deeper. Some victims survived for hours, even days. The Iron Maiden was a chamber of waiting death. But here's the strange part. Historians now believe the Iron Maiden may not have been widely used in the Middle Ages. Some argue it was created later, in the 18th or 19th century, and presented as medieval horror. Still, the myth itself became powerful. People in the Middle Ages believed in spiked coffins and whispered about them. And even if the Iron Maiden was more legend than fact, the fear it inspired was very real. In many ways, it didn't need to be real to terrify. But the Middle Ages didn't lack for real horrors. Because the last punishment we'll see, the Catherine wheel, was very real and very deadly. It may have been the worst of them all. If one punishment captured the pure cruelty of the medieval world, it was the Catherine wheel. The condemned was tied to a massive wooden wheel, arms and legs spread wide. The executioner then used a heavy iron bar to smash the limbs, shattering bones one by one. The body bent into unnatural shapes, but it didn't end there. The broken victim was woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted high on a post. Birds circled overhead, crows picked at the wounds. Sometimes the person was left alive, suffering for days, exposed to the elements while the crowd below looked on. Families were often forced to watch as their loved ones slowly died. The screams, the sight of the twisted body, the sound of bones cracking, these memories stayed with communities for years. The Catherine Wheel wasn't just execution. It was a warning carved into the minds of everyone who saw it. It said, "No one is beyond the reach of the law." Across Europe, from France to Germany, the wheel became a symbol of terror. It was so infamous that even saints were linked to it in legend, like Saint Catherine, who, according to story, was condemned to the wheel, but the device broke before it could kill her. From her came its haunting name. Unlike some punishments that may have been exaggerated over time, the Catherine Wheel was ultra real. And it shows us just how far the medieval world would go to maintain control, not through fairness, but through fear. These punishments weren't just about justice. They were about control. They were public, bloody, and unforgettable. People came to watch, not just to see a criminal punished, but to be reminded of what could happen to them. In a world without modern law or prisons, pain and fear kept order. And it worked, but it also left a shadow that still chills us today. Even hundreds of years later, just hearing about them makes us shiver. The Middle Ages were brutal. These punishments remind us that life back then was fragile and justice was cruel. Some sound like legends, but for the people who suffered them, they were real. And they remind us that history is often darker than the stories of knights and castles we grew up with. If you want to uncover more shocking secrets from the medieval world, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. Because the past still has many dark stories waiting to be told.